Mrs. Jenkins had a peculiar habit of counting her steps from the mailbox to the porch. She had been doing it since her knees had started giving her trouble, using the rhythmic motion to distract from the pain. Her white hair was tied back in a tight bun, and her glasses perched precariously on the edge of her nose as she squinted at the numbers scribbled on the newspaper. The scent of fresh ink filled the quiet afternoon air, mingling with the distant hum of a lawnmower and the occasional chirp of a bird. The newspaper crinkled in her grip, the headline about the recent string of missing pets in the neighborhood catching her eye again. She had already read the article twice, but it was the only thing of interest in the otherwise mundane local news. As she reached the porch, she heard the sound of tires on gravel. The rusty gate at the end of her driveway squealed open, and a car she didn't recognize pulled up. A young man, no more than 20, with a faded cap and a tired smile climbed out. He had a pizza box in his hand and a name tag that read Mike. She had ordered a pizza to treat herself after her weekly bridge club meeting got cancelled. It wasn't often she allowed herself such indulgences. The sight of the cheery logo on the box made her mouth water. Mike walked up the path, each step seeming to echo through the silence. Mrs. Jenkins felt a slight prickle of unease. He looked normal, but something about him was off. His eyes didn't quite meet hers, and he had a nervous energy that she couldn't quite place. She chastised herself for being so suspicious. He was just a boy trying to make a living. "Pizza delivery for Mrs. Jenkins," he called out, his voice a tad too high. Her stomach growled, reminding her of her hunger. She took a deep breath and stepped forward to greet him. "That's me," she said, trying to sound cheerful. Mike looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected an answer. He glanced at the newspaper in her hand, then back at her. "You be careful, miss," he murmured. "There's some weird stuff happening around here." Mrs. Jenkins felt a chill run down her spine, despite the warmth of the day. "What do you mean?" Mike shifted the pizza box from one hand to the other, his grip tightening. "It's just, well, I've had a couple of strange deliveries today." Her curiosity piqued. Mrs. Jenkins leaned in slightly. "Strange how?" Mike looked around nervously before speaking in a hushed tone. "People aren't home when I get there, but I swear I see shadows moving inside. And the pets. It's like they know something we don't. They go crazy when I show up." He paused, his eyes flicking to the overgrown bushes lining the path. "Some of the animals have gone missing after I leave." Jenkins felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The neighborhood had always been quiet, but lately, she had noticed a few oddities herself. The missing cats and dogs, the whispers of something not quite right. But she had brushed it off, attributing it to the overactive imagination of the local children. "Well, I'll keep an eye out," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Mike nodded, his eyes still darting around. "You do that, miss. And if you could, maybe don't leave the pizza out too long. Just, as a precaution." Mrs. Jenkins took the pizza, the warmth of the box seeping into her hands, and gave him a tight smile. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. As he drove away, she couldn't help but watch his car until it disappeared around the corner, the squeal of the tires lingering in the air. The pizza smelled heavenly, but her appetite had waned. She took it inside, setting it down on the kitchen counter with a sigh. The house felt eerily silent around her, and she found herself checking the locks on the doors and windows, something she hadn't done in years. Her cat, Mr. Whiskers, meowed from his perch by the window, his eyes fixed on the bushes outside. She chuckled, attributing her jitters to Mike's story. It was just the usual neighborhood drama, she told herself. The living room was cast in a soft glow from the setting sun, and the TV droned on in the background, playing an old black-and-white movie she hadn't been watching. Mrs. Jenkins sat at her kitchen table, her eyes scanning the paper again. The article about the missing pets had taken on a new, sinister undertone. She tried to convince herself that it was just the power of suggestion, but the knot in her stomach grew tighter with each passing minute. Her gaze fell on the pizza box, the cheese bubbling through the pepperoni. She took a deep breath and opened the box, the aroma of melted cheese and garlic breadsticks filling the air. Her eyes narrowed as she took a bite. The cheese was cold, the crust soggy. Mrs. Jenkins frowned. That wasn't right. The delivery had just been made, it should still be hot. The clock on the microwave read 4:52 p.m. The delivery was supposed to arrive at 4:45. Had Mike been telling the truth about his strange experiences? She couldn't help but feel a tingle of fear creep up her spine. The phone rang, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was the pizza place, confirming her order. The voice on the other end was friendly, but it sent a jolt through her. What if Mike wasn't from the pizza place at all? What if he had some sinister motive for delivering cold food? She decided to eat the pizza in the living room, closer to the phone and the panic button by the side of her chair. Jenkins took another bite, the coldness now a stark reminder of Mike's warning. Her teeth sank into something hard and metallic. She spit out the mouthful onto her plate, revealing a small, shiny object. It was a USB stick, embedded in the crust. She picked it up gingerly, her heart racing. The TV flickered, and the room grew colder. The cat's meow turned into a hiss, and his fur stood on end as he stared at the object in her hand. Her trembling fingers inserted the USB into her computer. The screen flickered to life with grainy, shaky footage. It was Mike, in the kitchen of what she assumed was a different house, holding a knife. The video was timestamped from earlier in the day. The sound was muffled, but she could make out the terrified whimpers of a caged animal. Her hand hovered over the mouse, unsure of what to click next. The video played on, revealing more disturbing scenes of Mike and what appeared to be a makeshift lab. The screen went black, and the word "next" flashed in bold red letters. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't breathe. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she could feel the blood draining from her face. This wasn't just a prank or a misunderstanding, it was something far more sinister. She had to call someone, but who? The police? They would think she was just a paranoid old woman with a wild imagination. Her eyes darted to the phone, then to the window. What if Mike came back? The USB stick felt like it was burning a hole in her hand. She clicked play again, her stomach churning as the video continued. The camera panned to a series of cages, each one holding a trembling, wide-eyed animal. They looked sick, malnourished. The sight brought bile to her throat, but she forced herself to keep watching. There was something she had to understand, some clue that would explain this horror. Mike's voice, low and urgent, filled the room. "You think you're safe, but you're not. They're coming for you. For all of us." His face filled the screen, a crazed look in his eyes. "But I can save you," he whispered, a twisted smile playing across his lips. "Just watch." The video cut to a montage of the neighborhood, houses she recognized passing by in a blur. Her own home came into view, and she watched as a shadowy figure slipped around the side of her house. The camera followed it into her yard, the video feed jittering as if it were being held by unsteady hands. The figure approached her back door, and she saw her own reflection in the glass, holding the pizza box. The footage was from earlier today, right before Mike had arrived. And tightened around the USB stick, the cold plastic feeling slick with sweat. The video showed the figure placing something under her doormat before retreating into the shadows. Mrs. Jenkins's eyes darted to the door, then back to the screen. It was a small, black device with blinking lights. The screen went black again, and she heard a faint beeping from outside. Panic set in, and she realized the device must be connected to the pizza box. With shaking hands, she grabbed the phone and dialed 911. "Please hurry," she managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't dare speak too loudly, fearful of alerting whatever was out there. The dispatcher's voice was calm, reassuring, but the seconds ticked by like hours. Mrs. Jenkins stared at the door, willing it to hold. The beeping grew louder, and she could feel the vibrations through the floor. Suddenly, Mr. Whiskers bolted from the room, his nails scraping against the wooden floor. The beeping stopped, and she heard the sound of something being dragged across the porch. A shadow fell over the window, and she screamed into the phone, her voice finally finding its strength. "They're here. Oh, God, they're here." The dispatcher's tone sharpened. "Mom, stay calm. I need you to tell me what's happening." Mrs. Jenkins tried to control her breathing, her eyes glued to the door. "Something's outside," she whispered. The shadows grew denser, the silence outside punctuated only by the distant wail of a siren. The pizza box on the counter was no longer the comforting symbol of an unexpected treat, it was a harbinger of fear and uncertainty. Her hand hovered over the phone, ready to drop it at the first sign of danger. The sirens grew louder, offering a thread of hope. But so did the noises outside. Scratching, thumping, something heavy moving closer. The door rattled, and she felt the vibrations in her bones. "They're breaking in," she murmured into the receiver. The dispatcher's voice grew more urgent. "Ma'am, is there a safe room in your house?" Mrs. Jenkins nodded, though she knew the woman couldn't see her. "Yes," she whispered, her eyes never leaving the door. "The bathroom." "Good. Get there now and lock the door behind you. Stay on the line with me, okay?" Mrs. Jenkins nodded again, her legs feeling like jelly as she pushed herself away from the table. The pizza box remained on the counter, a stark reminder of the horror she had stumbled upon. She tiptoed through the hallway, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet like they were alive. The bathroom was just a few steps away, but it felt like a mile. She reached the door, her hand shaking as she turned the knob. The bathroom was small, but it had a lock, and she slammed it shut behind her. The lock clicked into place, echoing through the house like a gunshot. She slid the bolt home, her heart racing as she slumped against the cold porcelain tub. The sirens grew closer, the wailing a cacophony in her ears. She could still hear the scratching at the door, the thumps growing more insistent. Mrs. Jenkins's breath came in short, ragged gasps, her chest tightening. She tried to focus on the dispatcher's voice, a lifeline in the chaos. "Stay on the floor," the woman instructed, "and keep away from the windows." Her eyes darted around the small room, landing on a plunger and a toilet brush. Pathetic weapons, but better than nothing. She picked them up, clutching them tightly as the pounding grew louder. The door frame creaked, the wood splintering under the onslaught. She could see shadows moving under the gap at the bottom of the door, and she knew she didn't have much time. The sirens were close, but she couldn't be sure if they were for her or some other poor soul. The dispatcher's voice grew frantic in her ear. "Mrs. Jenkins, the officers are almost there. Stay put." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, though she knew the woman couldn't see her. The plunger felt heavy and awkward in her hands, the bristles of the toilet brush prickling her palms. She could see the shadows of the creatures under the door, their movements erratic and menacing. The pounding grew louder, and the door began to give way, the hinges groaning under the pressure. Her heart pounding in her ears, she slammed her back against the tub, willing the lock to hold. The plunger slipped from her grip, clattering to the floor tiles, but she kept a firm hold on the brush. The sirens grew so close that their wail seemed to shake the house itself. She whispered a prayer, her eyes squeezed shut, as the door began to crack. The first splinter of wood flew into the bathroom, and she screamed, her eyes snapping open. Through the widening gap, she saw the shadowy forms of the creatures that had been lurking outside. They were unlike anything she had ever seen before, a twisted mix of animal and something else entirely. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent intent, and their teeth looked like they could tear through steel. The door bulged inwards as the creatures threw themselves against it, the lock straining with each impact. Mrs. Jenkins's grip tightened on the toilet brush, the plastic handle slick with sweat. The dispatcher's voice grew distant, muffled by the sound of the pounding on the door. She had to fight, had to survive. The fear that had paralyzed her moments ago transformed into a white-hot determination. The creature forced its way through the gap, snarling and snapping. Its fur was matted with dirt and something darker, something that smelled of decay. Mrs. Jenkins screamed and swung the brush, the bristles catching it across the snout. It yelped and retreated, but the others followed, their eyes never leaving her. The door gave way with a splintering crash, and the creatures flooded into the bathroom. Mrs. Jenkins's heart hammered against her ribs, and she swung the brush with all her might, the plastic handle cracking against bone and fur. They darted around her, too fast to be fully seen, their movements a blur of darkness and teeth. One lunged for her, and she stumbled, dropping the brush. It clattered to the floor, but she managed to grab the plunger. As the creature closed in, she raised it above her head, ready to fight. The sirens grew louder outside, the flash of red and blue lights strobing through the cracks in the blinds. The creature paused, its eyes darting towards the window, then back at her. The sirens hit a crescendo, and the front door burst open, flooding the house with the sound of booted footsteps and shouting. The creature snarled, the sound echoing through the small bathroom. "Police! Freeze!" The bark of authority was enough to make the creatures flinch, their movements faltering for a brief, precious moment. Mrs. Jenkins took advantage of the distraction, sliding the plunger handle through the loop of her arm and using it as a makeshift baton. The first creature lunged again, and she swung, connecting with a sickening thud against its side. It yelped and retreated, giving her a chance to scramble to her feet. The bathroom door was wide open, and she could see the flashes of lights and the shadows of the officers moving through her house. The creatures grew more agitated, their snarls and hisses becoming a cacophony of fear and anger. One bolted past her, fleeing the approaching humans. She took a deep, shuddering breath and stepped out of the bathroom, her heart racing. The hallway was a whirlwind of blue and red lights, the officers' faces stern and focused as they searched for the threat. One of them, a young woman with a tight bun and a stern look, spotted her and rushed over. "Ma'am, are you okay?" she asked, her hand on her gun. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They're in here," she managed to say, pointing at the creatures still lurking in the bathroom. The officer's eyes widened as she took in the bizarre scene. "What the hell are those things?" she murmured, her hand tightening on the gun. Mrs. Jenkins could only shake her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know, but they're after me." The young officer's gaze darted between Mrs. Jenkins and the shadowy figures in the bathroom, the tension in the air thick enough to slice with a knife. "Stay here," she ordered, her hand reaching for the radio at her side. The creatures grew more frantic as the sirens outside grew quieter, their eyes darting between the old woman and the officers that now filled the hallway. The room was a stark contrast of the mundane and the macabre, the floral wallpaper and the porcelain tub a backdrop to the horror unfolding. Mrs. Jenkins watched, her breathing shallow and uneven, as the officers moved into the room with caution, guns drawn and flashlights sweeping the floor. One creature took the opportunity to bolt past the officers, disappearing into the living room. The sound of breaking glass and the scream of a cat pierced the tension. Mrs. Jenkins felt a pang of fear for Mr. Whiskers, her trembling hand reaching out to the plunger she had dropped. "Ma'am, stay here," the young officer said firmly, her voice steady despite the chaos. She stepped over the threshold of the bathroom, gun pointed into the darkened space. Mrs. Jenkins watched her go, feeling both relief and a strange sense of abandonment. The creature that had bolted from the bathroom had left a trail of darkness in its wake, the shadows seemingly alive and pulsing. The living room was a mess, the curtains torn and the furniture knocked askew. Mr. Whiskers was nowhere to be seen, and Mrs. Jenkins's heart sank. The officers fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. One called out, "Clear!" from the kitchen, and another followed suit from the bedroom. But the living room remained a tense battleground, the shadows deepening as the creatures grew bolder. Mrs. Jenkins watched from the doorway, her heart in her throat. One of the creatures leapt from the couch, knocking over a lamp, its eyes locked on the retreating form of Mr. Whiskers. The cat darted under the coffee table, his eyes wide with terror. The creature paused, as if sensing the old woman's gaze, then turned towards her with a snarl. The officer by her side fired, a shot deafening in the enclosed space. The creature yelped and fell, its body convulsing briefly before going still. The room fell silent, the only sound the ringing in Mrs. Jenkins's ears. She stared at the lifeless form, feeling a mix of relief and horror. The officer approached, nudging the creature with the toe of her boot. "What the hell is this?" The creature's fur was patchy, its skin a sickly grey beneath the matted strands. It looked like a twisted, malformed dog, but the eyes, they were something else entirely. They were human, filled with a malicious intelligence that made her stomach turn. "I don't know," she whispered, her hand shaking as she held onto the plunger. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and fear. The young woman who had been by her side bent down, her flashlight beam illuminating the USB stick that lay on the floor, just outside the bathroom. She picked it up with a gloved hand, her brow furrowing as she examined it. "Ma'am, do you know what this is?" Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was in the pizza. I watched the video." The young officer's gaze sharpened. Stay here. Don't move. She turned and sprinted out of the room, shouting for her colleagues. Mrs. Jenkins remained rooted to the spot, the plunger trembling in her hand. She could feel the fear pulsing through her veins like a living thing, demanding she run, hide, do something. Anything but stand there. But she had nowhere to go, no place to hide. Her eyes darted to the USB stick, the tiny device that had brought all this chaos into her quiet, predictable life. The house was a cacophony of shouts and running footsteps as the officers searched for the remaining creatures. The sound of shattering glass from the living room made her flinch, and she tightened her grip on the plunger, ready to face whatever monstrosity was next. But the noises grew fainter, the chaos receding like a tide retreating from the shore. Her eyes remained glued to the USB stick, the silent witness to the horror that had unfolded in her own kitchen. What was on that video? What had Mike known? Why had he given it to her? Questions swirled in her mind, each one darker than the last. The living room grew quiet, the shadows retreating into the corners as the officers searched the rest of the house. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't move, couldn't tear her gaze away from the stick. It was as if it had a strange power over her, a siren's call that promised answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. The young officer returned, her face ashen. "Ma'am, we've secured the premises. We need to get you to safety." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her knees feeling like they might give out at any moment. The weight of what had just occurred was starting to settle in her bones, making her feel old and frail. She followed the officer into the living room, her eyes scanning the destruction. The shadows had retreated, but the fear remained, a palpable presence that clung to her like a shroud. The officer took the USB stick, her eyes flicking over it briefly before pocketing it. "We need to get you somewhere safe," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her mind racing. "My neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. She'll take me in." The officer nodded, her eyes scanning the room one last time before leading Mrs. Jenkins out of the house. The night air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the stifling fear inside. The street was alive with the flashing lights of police cars and the murmur of neighbors peeking out of their windows. Mrs. Jenkins clutched her robe closer, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Mrs. Thompson, a plump lady with a penchant for garden gnomes, answered the door almost immediately. Her eyes widened when she saw Mrs. Jenkins's state, and she ushered her inside without a word. The living room was a kaleidoscope of color and clutter, but it felt like the safest place on earth at that moment. The TV blared a game show, and the smell of burnt toast filled the air. Mrs. Thompson's comforting arm around her shoulder was a lifeline in the storm of uncertainty. As Mrs. Jenkins sat on the plump couch, she recounted the events of the evening. The cold pizza, the USB stick, and the creatures that had invaded her home. Mrs. Thompson's expression grew increasingly horrified, but she didn't interrupt, just nodded solemnly, her hand patting Mrs. Jenkins's back. When the story was done, she handed her a cup of tea, the steam wafting up to kiss her nose with a comforting scent of chamomile. The police officers finished their search, confirming that the house was indeed clear. They assured Mrs. Jenkins that they would review the footage on the USB stick and get to the bottom of this disturbing incident. One of them, an older man with a kind face, took down her statement with a gentle efficiency that helped ease her nerves somewhat. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as she sat in Mrs. Thompson's cozy living room. Her thoughts kept returning to Mike. Had he been a victim too? Or was he somehow involved in this nightmare? The USB stick and its grim contents were a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. The officers filed out, the blue and red lights from their cars painting the street in a surreal dance of color. The quiet that followed was almost deafening. Mrs. Thompson offered a tray of stale cookies, her eyes filled with concern. "You're sure you don't want to go to the hospital?" she asked, her voice quivering slightly. Mrs. Jenkins sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her. "No, I'll be fine," she lied, her voice shaky. "Just need to rest." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her own fear evident. "Of course, dear. You take as long as you need." Women sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Mrs. Jenkins's mind raced with questions, the video's images playing on a loop in her head. Who had sent her this? What did they want from her? Was Mike really trying to help, or was he part of this twisted game? Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of her phone. She fumbled in her pocket, her trembling hands struggling to retrieve it. The screen illuminated with a message from an unknown number: "Don't trust anyone. They're watching." The text sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through her. She looked up at Mrs. Thompson, who was watching her with a concerned frown. Mrs. Jenkins read the message again, her heart hammering in her chest. Was Mike trying to communicate with her? Was he in danger? The question spun in her head like a tornado. She had to find out more. She had to warn the officers. But what if it was a trap? Her hand hovered over the phone, unsure of what to do next. Mrs. Thompson's worried gaze grew more intense. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her eyes flickering to the screen. Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. I need to show this to the officers," she said, her voice trembling. "It's important." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her eyes wide with worry. "Of course, dear. I'll go with you." The two of them made their way back to the porch, the cool night air a stark contrast to the warmth of the house. The police cars had gone, leaving the street eerily quiet, the only sound the distant wail of a siren. Mrs. Jenkins felt a cold dread creeping up her spine, the message on her phone burning in her hand. She approached the young officer who had taken the USB stick, her heart racing. "Officer, I received a message," she stuttered, holding out her phone. The officer took it, her eyes scanning the screen before looking up with a furrowed brow. "What does this mean?" Mrs. Jenkins whispered. The officer read the message again, her expression unreadable. "It could be a prank, ma'am," she said, trying to sound reassuring. But Mrs. Jenkins could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. "But what if it's not?" Mrs. Jenkins insisted, her voice quivering. "What if Mike was trying to tell me something?" The young officer took a moment, then handed the phone back. "We'll look into it, ma'am. For now, stay with Mrs. Thompson. Don't go anywhere alone, and keep the doors and windows locked." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, clutching the phone tightly. As she stepped back into the house, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows outside seemed to twitch and stretch, reaching for her. Mrs. Thompson's hand was warm and comforting on her shoulder, grounding her in reality. It grew longer, the comforting hum of the TV a backdrop to their uneasy whispers. Mrs. Jenkins's eyes kept darting to the clock, counting down the minutes until dawn. The message from Mike was a constant weight on her mind. Was he okay? What had he meant? Mrs. Thompson, ever the hospitable host, offered to sleep on the couch so Mrs. Jenkins could take her bed. The old woman lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the TV from the living room. She knew sleep would evade her, her thoughts too jumbled with fear and doubt. The room was filled with the scent of potpourri and lavender, but it did little to soothe her frazzled nerves. Her mind kept drifting to Mike, the nervous pizza boy with secrets too heavy for his young shoulders. What was he involved in? Why had he sent her that video? And what did he mean by their watching? Her heart ached for the poor boy, and she hoped beyond hope that he was safe. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, Mrs. Jenkins's eyelids grew heavy. Despite her fear, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving her exhausted. She drifted into a fitful sleep, her dreams plagued by shadowy figures and snarling creatures. When she awoke, the house was silent. Mrs. Thompson was nowhere to be found, the TV off. Panic surged through her as she sat up, her heart racing. The bedside clock read 6:45 a.m., and the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a soft glow into the room. Her thoughts immediately turned to Mr. Whiskers. She hoped he'd found a safe hiding spot in the house, but she knew the chances were slim. The creatures had been so vicious, so determined. The memory of their human-like eyes filled her with dread. Mrs. Jenkins carefully swung her legs over the side of the bed, her body protesting with every movement. She was covered in bruises from the fight in the bathroom, a reminder of the horror she'd faced just hours ago. She shuffled into the living room, the silence of the house pressing down on her like a weight. Mrs. Thompson was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes bloodshot and her hair in disarray. She looked up as Mrs. Jenkins entered, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice thick with worry. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head, taking a seat opposite her. I kept seeing those things. And Mike. She took a shaky breath. I can't stop thinking about what's happening. Mrs. Thompson placed a gentle hand on her arm. You've been through a terrible ordeal. It's only natural you're on edge. The quiet was pierced by the sound of sirens growing louder in the distance. Mrs. Jenkins's pulse spiked. They're back? She whispered, her eyes darting to the window. Thompson nodded, her grip on the coffee mug tightening. It sounds like it. Mrs. Jenkins's heart hammered in her chest, the sirens growing louder by the second. She could feel the house vibrating with the impending arrival of the police. What do we do? She whispered, her voice trembling. Mrs. Thompson's eyes searched hers, and she spoke with a calmness that belied the fear in her voice. We wait for them, dear. They'll keep us safe. But the sirens didn't stop, and the tension grew as the moments stretched into an eternity. The sound grew closer, and Mrs. Jenkins's stomach knotted. Something wasn't right. The sirens weren't the comforting wail of rescue anymore, they were the harbingers of something more sinister. Mrs. Thompson's hand was warm and comforting, but Mrs. Jenkins felt a coldness creeping over her, a premonition that chilled her to the bone. The house was a tomb, the only movement the shadows that danced on the walls with the flashing lights from outside. The sirens grew deafening, and the vibration of the floorboards grew more intense. Mrs. Jenkins's eyes darted to the door as it began to rattle in its frame. Mrs. Thompson jumped to her feet, knocking over her coffee. They're here, she whispered, her voice hopeful but tinged with fear. They waited, their breaths shallow, as the sirens grew louder and louder until they felt like they were inside the house. But the expected knock on the door didn't come. Instead, the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside was followed by an eerie silence. The sirens had stopped. Mrs. Jenkins felt the blood drain from her face. She had a terrible, sinking feeling that something was wrong. She stumbled to the window, her hand shaking as she peered through the blind slats. There was no police car, no officers rushing to their rescue. Just darkness and the looming shadow of the house across the street. Her eyes widened as she saw it, the glow of the USB stick, lying on the pavement, its screen flickering with the same horrific images she had witnessed the night before. The creatures were back, and they had led the police away from her. The sirens were a taunt, a cruel joke played by some unseen puppeteer. Mrs. Jenkins turned to Mrs. Thompson, her voice barely a whisper. They've tricked us. The color drained from her neighbor's face as understanding dawned. They were alone again, and the creatures were closing in. They retreated to the kitchen, the room now feeling like a prison cell as the sirens grew faint and the darkness outside seemed to press closer. Mrs. Jenkins's mind raced with thoughts of Mike and the USB stick. Was he part of this? Or had he been trying to save her? Mrs. Thompson grabbed a rolling pin from the counter, her eyes wide with fear. What do we do? She whispered. Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath, trying to push aside the panic that threatened to consume her. We need to get out of here, she said, her voice surprisingly calm. They can't be far. Mrs. Thompson nodded, her grip on the rolling pin tightening. They moved through the house, their steps as silent as shadows. The sirens had led them into a trap, luring the officers away from their protection. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the creatures knew their every move. The back door creaked open, and a cold draft of air brushed against their faces. Mrs. Thompson held her breath, her eyes searching the backyard. The garden gnomes stared back at them, their plastic faces twisted into sinister grins in the flickering streetlight. The air smelled faintly of rain and something off. Something decayed and otherworldly. Mrs. Jenkins took the lead, her hand shaking as she clutched a kitchen knife. They had to get to her house, retrieve the USB stick, and find Mr. Whiskers. She knew it was a risk, but she couldn't leave her cat to face those monsters alone. They stepped out into the backyard, the cold dew seeping into their slippers. The air was thick with tension, the silence only broken by the distant wail of the retreating sirens. Mrs. Jenkins's eyes darted from left to right, searching for any sign of movement. The moon cast eerie shadows across the lawn, making it difficult to discern reality from the fear playing tricks on her mind. This way, she murmured, leading Mrs. Thompson towards the fence that separated the two properties. The wooden slats groaned in protest as they climbed over, the splinters digging into their palms. They dropped down onto the wet grass on the other side, the cold shock jolting them into action. Mrs. Jenkins's house loomed before them, a silent sentinel in the moonlit night. The windows were dark, but she could feel the malevolence lurking within. Her heart was racing, her breath coming in short gasps. The sirens had disappeared into the night, leaving them at the mercy of the creatures. They approached the back door with caution, the knob cold and unyielding under her trembling hand. It was unlocked. She pushed it open slowly, the creak of the hinges echoing through the house like a scream. The kitchen was in shambles, the remnants of their battle scattered across the floor. The USB stick lay on the counter, the screen still pulsing with that horrific video. Eyes searched the room, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Where was Mr. Whiskers? The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the hum of the fridge and the distant tick of a clock. Mrs. Thompson hovered in the doorway, the rolling pin held like a weapon, her eyes wide with terror. Mrs. Jenkins stepped into the kitchen, the coldness of the floor seeping through her socks. She picked up the USB stick, the plastic cold and slick in her hand. The images on the screen made her stomach turn, but she had to know more. Why had Mike given this to her? What did he want her to do? The house was still, the only sound the persistent ticking of the clock in the hallway. She moved through the shadows, the knife held tightly in front of her, her eyes searching for any sign of movement. Mrs. Thompson remained by the back door, her eyes darting around the room, the rolling pin raised in a defensive stance. They reached the living room, where the shattered remnants of a lamp lay on the floor, casting jagged shadows across the carpet. Mrs. Jenkins's heart pounded as she spotted a flicker of movement under the couch. "Mr. Whiskers?" she called out softly, her voice shaking. The cat emerged, his fur on end and eyes wide with terror. He mewed pitifully, his body quivering as he recognized his owner. Mrs. Jenkins dropped to her knees, scooping him into her arms. "Thank God," she murmured, burying her face in his fur. The warmth and weight of him grounded her, offering a semblance of comfort amidst the horror. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her gaze darting around the room. "We need to get out of here," she hissed, her eyes never leaving the shadows. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, cradling Mr. Whiskers tightly. They moved through the house, the floorboards groaning under their weight, every creak sounding like a gunshot in the tense silence. The USB stick in her pocket felt like a hot coal against her thigh, the images burned into her mind's eye. She couldn't shake the feeling that the creatures were watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. They reached the stairs, the banister sticky with something she didn't want to think about. The smell of blood and fear lingered in the air. Mrs. Jenkins took a tentative step, Mr. Whiskers trembling in her arms. The cat's eyes were wide, his pupils dilated with terror. He knew something was wrong, and his instincts were rarely mistaken. They moved up the stairs, each step a silent prayer that they wouldn't be heard. The bedroom door was open, a sliver of moonlight cutting through the darkness. Reached the top, Mrs. Jenkins could hear faint scratching sounds from the bedroom. She paused, her heart hammering in her chest. The creatures were inside. She clutched Mr. Whiskers closer, her knuckles white against the knife's handle. Mrs. Thompson's breath was hot on her neck, her own fear palpable. They tiptoed down the hall, the floorboards protesting with every step. The door to her room was ajar, the light from the street lamp outside casting a thin strip across the carpet. Mrs. Jenkins could see the USB stick's light pulsing from the bedside table. It was as if it was calling to her, taunting her with the secrets it held. The scratching grew louder, and Mrs. Jenkins knew she had to face whatever was in there. For Mike, for Mr. Whiskers, and for her own sanity. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the hinges letting out a soft groan. The room was a mess, the bed covers torn and the furniture overturned. The USB stick's screen flickered in the corner, casting an eerie light that danced across the walls. Mrs. Jenkins stepped into the room, her heart in her throat. The scratching had stopped, and the silence was deafening. Mrs. Thompson hovered in the doorway, the rolling pin at the ready. A shadow moved in the corner of Mrs. Jenkins's eye, and she spun around, the knife poised to strike. But it was only a piece of paper caught in the breeze from the open window. Rain had started to patter against the glass, the sound muffling the world outside. Her eyes fell upon the USB stick, the images still playing on repeat. The sight of Mike with the knife made her stomach lurch. Was he a victim or an accomplice? The message was clear: don't trust anyone. But could she trust him? Mrs. Jenkins approached the bedside table, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. She picked up the USB stick, the weight of it seeming to grow heavier in her hand. She inserted it into her laptop, the screen casting an eerie glow on her face. The video played on, Mike's panicked face and the caged creatures now too familiar to her. But there was something new. A code flashed on the screen, numbers and symbols that made no sense to her. Her eyes narrowed as she tried to memorize the sequence, a spark of determination igniting within her. If this USB stick held the key to understanding what was happening, then she had to try. Mrs. Thompson hovered by the door, her eyes flickering to the darkened hallway. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the patter of the rain. Jenkins held up a hand for silence, her gaze glued to the screen. The code was complex, a jumble of numbers and symbols that seemed to pulse and shift as if alive. She watched as it scrolled up, knowing she had to act fast. "Grab a pen and some paper," she murmured. Mrs. Thompson scurried to the desk, her trembling hands fumbling with the drawer. She handed Mrs. Jenkins the items, her eyes never leaving the bedroom door. Mrs. Jenkins quickly jotted down the code, her mind racing to make sense of it. What could it mean? Was it a clue to Mike's whereabouts, or perhaps a warning about the creatures? The rain outside grew louder, the wind howling like a mournful beast. The house shuddered in response, and Mrs. Jenkins felt the first stirrings of panic. The code was unlike anything she had ever seen, a cryptic message that seemed to beckon her deeper into the horror. But she refused to back down. Mike had sent this to her for a reason. He had entrusted her with this knowledge, and she had to honor that. She had to find out what it meant. Mrs. Jenkins studied the paper, her mind racing. The numbers and symbols swirled before her eyes, forming patterns that she desperately tried to decode. The room was cold, the rain outside tapping against the window like a sinister Morse code. Mr. Whiskers had curled into a tight ball in her arms, his trembling subsiding but not his fear. Suddenly, a sharp crack of thunder split the silence, making both women jump. Mrs. Thompson's grip on the rolling pin tightened, her knuckles turning white. "We can't stay here," she murmured, her voice strained. "We have to get out." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, the code still etched in her mind. "We'll figure this out, but you're right. We need to get somewhere safe." She tucked the paper with the code into her pocket, the USB stick already nestled there. The rain grew more intense, the wind howling like a pack of hungry beasts. They moved swiftly through the house, avoiding the windows and the prying eyes of the creatures they knew were out there. Mrs. Jenkins's thoughts swirled around Mike's message, her mind racing to connect the dots. The video had been a warning, but it was also a map. She had to believe that it would lead them to safety, or at least to some answers. Mrs. Thompson suggested they go to the basement. "It's the most secure part of the house," she whispered. "And there's a window that leads to the alley. We can escape through there if we have to." Jenkins nodded, her eyes flicking to the stairs. The creatures could be anywhere. They moved as silently as possible, Mr. Whiskers tucked under her arm, his fur wet from her own fearful sweat. The house was a labyrinth of shadows, each corner a potential trap. The rain outside had turned into a torrent, the thunder and lightning punctuating the tension with jolts of terror. The basement door creaked open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase leading into darkness. Mrs. Thompson flicked on the light, illuminating the cobwebbed stairs. "Stay close," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. They descended carefully, the wood groaning beneath their weight. The basement was cluttered with forgotten items, the musty scent of age and dampness filling their nostrils. They moved through the maze of boxes and furniture, the light from the single bulb casting elongated shadows. Mrs. Jenkins felt claustrophobic, the weight of the USB stick in her pocket a constant reminder of the horrors they faced. They found a small, dust-covered table and chairs, and Mrs. Jenkins set Mr. Whiskers down. He immediately sought refuge under the nearest chair, his eyes never leaving them. Mrs. Thompson handed her a flashlight, and she shone it around the room, searching for anything that might be useful. The beam of light danced across a toolbox in the corner, and she moved towards it, her heart racing. If they had to fight their way out, she needed something more substantial than a kitchen knife. Inside, she found a hammer and a wrench, both heavy and solid. She handed the wrench to Mrs. Thompson, who hefted it with surprising strength. The room was cold, and Mrs. Jenkins could see her breath in the air. They sat down at the table, the only source of light the flickering bulb above them. Rainwater seeped through the cracks in the cinder block walls, forming tiny puddles on the concrete floor. The USB stick lay on the table, the images of the creatures frozen on the screen. Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the stairs. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Jenkins looked down at the USB stick, the flickering screen casting an eerie glow on the table. "We have to find Mike," she said with a steely resolve. "This code. It's our only lead." They sat in tense silence, the rain outside pounding a relentless rhythm against the house above them. Mrs. Jenkins's mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle that was unfolding. What had Mike stumbled into? Why was he delivering such a cryptic message? Mrs. Thompson spoke up, her voice shaky. "Maybe we should just wait for the police to come back." Jenkins shook her head. "We can't. They're expecting us to do just that. Whoever's behind this knows we'll be scared and looking for help." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't just about me. It's about the neighborhood. We can't let them win." Her words hung in the air, the gravity of the situation settling upon them both. Mrs. Thompson nodded, her grip on the wrench tightening. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice stronger now. Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath, her eyes still on the USB stick. "We find out where this code leads. It's the only way to understand what's happening and to find Mike." The thunder rumbled ominously, the light flickering as the storm raged on. They decided to split up, Mrs. Thompson staying with Mr. Whiskers in the basement while Mrs. Jenkins would sneak out to the alley and try to find a place with internet access to decipher the code. The rain had turned the streets into a river, and the wind tugged at her clothes like icy fingers as she made her way through the darkened neighborhood. The USB stick was a beacon in her pocket, the cold metal pressing against her skin like a promise of hope. The local coffee shop was only a few blocks away, its warm lights spilling onto the sidewalk, offering a stark contrast to the shadowy alleyways she navigated. Mrs. Jenkins felt a pang of nostalgia as she approached the familiar sight. It had been her sanctuary before the nightmare began, a place of comfort and community. Now, it was a potential lifeline in a world gone mad. Her hand was shaking as she pushed open the door, the bell jingling a cheerful tune that seemed out of place. The barista looked up from the counter, a young college student with a name tag that read Jess. The girl's eyes widened at the sight of Mrs. Jenkins, soaked and wild-eyed, clutching a USB stick. "Are you okay, Mom?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Mrs. Jenkins forced a smile, trying to appear calm. "Just a little storm-battered. Could I use your computer for a few minutes?" she asked, her voice strained. Jess looked around the empty shop, the rain outside providing a rhythmic backdrop to the quiet night. She nodded, pointing to the corner table with the shop's single computer. "It's the last one we have, but sure." Mrs. Jenkins sat down, her trembling hands inserting the USB stick into the computer's port. The screen flickered to life, displaying the same chilling footage she had watched earlier. The barista hovered, curiosity piqued by the urgency in Mrs. Jenkins's demeanor. Are those real?" she whispered. Jenkins nodded gravely. "I need to access the internet, please," she said, her eyes never leaving the screen. The barista nodded and turned away, her own fear palpable in the air. The coffee shop's warmth enveloped her, a stark contrast to the cold, wet streets outside. The code was complex, a series of digits and symbols that seemed to dance before her eyes. She typed furiously, her mind racing with thoughts of Mike and the creatures that had invaded their lives. The computer's fan whirred to life, the only other sound in the otherwise quiet shop. The rain outside had turned into a torrent, the drops beating against the window like a drumroll of doom. Jess hovered, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "What are you looking for?" she asked softly. Mrs. Jenkins glanced up, her eyes haunted. "Answers," she replied. The code on this USB might be a clue to what's happening. Jess looked at the screen over her shoulder, her eyes widening as the video played. What is all this? She whispered, her voice trembling. Mrs. Jenkins leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing. I'm not sure, she said, but I think it's a message. And I think it's going to help us understand what those things are. Jess's hand hovered over the keyboard, then she began to type, her nimble fingers flying over the keys. Let's try running it through a decoder, she suggested, her eyes never leaving the screen. It might give us some clues. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her own fear momentarily forgotten in the face of action. Together, they worked in a tense silence, the only sounds the clacking of the keyboard and the muted patter of the rain outside. The code began to shift, letters and numbers morphing into a series of GPS coordinates. It's an address, Jess whispered, her eyes widening. But it's not in the neighborhood. It's on the outskirts of town. Mrs. Jenkins felt a knot form in her stomach. The creatures and their origins were closer than she had ever imagined. We need to go there, she said firmly, standing up. Can you watch Mr. Whiskers and Mrs. Thompson for a bit? Jess looked torn, glancing at the storm outside and then back at the USB stick. I don't know, she stammered. It's pretty late, and I should close up soon. Please, Mrs. Jenkins begged, her voice cracking. This is a matter of life and death. If we don't find out what's going on, who knows what will happen to Mike, or to the rest of us? Jess looked from the USB stick to Mrs. Jenkins, then back again. With a deep breath, she nodded. Okay, I'll watch over them. You go. But be careful. She handed Mrs. Jenkins a set of keys to the coffee shop. Take my car. It's parked out back. Mrs. Jenkins took the keys, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered before sprinting out the back door into the alley, the cold rain soaking her to the bone. She found the car, a small, beat-up hatchback, and climbed in, the engine roaring to life with a comforting growl. The headlights pierced the inky blackness as she turned the car towards the mysterious GPS coordinates. The drive was harrowing, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the deluge. The streets were deserted, the only signs of life the occasional flicker of a streetlight or the distant silhouettes of the creatures lurking in the shadows. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes never leaving the road as she navigated the unfamiliar terrain. The GPS on her phone guided her through the storm, the robotic voice seemingly oblivious to the chaos unfolding around her. As Mrs. Jenkins approached the outskirts of town, the buildings grew sparse, giving way to the dense woods that encircled the city. The coordinates led her to a nondescript warehouse, its corrugated metal exterior rattling in the wind. The sight of it sent a shiver down her spine, the eerie silence only broken by the relentless rain. Pulling over to the side of the road, she killed the engine and sat in the car for a moment, listening. The warehouse loomed before her, the darkness inside seemingly alive with the whispers of the storm. She took the USB stick, her hand shaking as she clutched it tightly. This was it. This was where she would find answers. Mrs. Jenkins stepped out into the downpour, the cold water soaking through her clothes in an instant. The USB stick in her pocket felt like a talisman, guiding her through the dark. She approached the warehouse, the thunder masking her footsteps. The door was unlocked, swinging open with a screech that echoed through the night. The warehouse was a maze of shadows and rusty metal, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something other. Mrs. Jenkins moved cautiously, her flashlight beam bouncing off the walls as she searched for any sign of life. The video from the USB stick played on a loop in her mind, the caged creatures and Mike's desperate message a stark reminder of the danger she faced. Her footsteps echoed in the vast space, the only sound but for the steady drip of rainwater from the leaky roof. The walls were lined with crates and machinery, the labels on the boxes faded and illegible. In the distance, she heard the faint buzz of something electrical, a pulsing heartbeat in the silence. Mrs. Jenkins's flashlight danced across the floor, revealing a trail of wet footprints leading deeper into the warehouse. She followed them, her heart racing with every step. The USB stick in her pocket felt like a hot ember, urging her on. The air grew colder, the stench of fear and decay stronger. The buzz grew louder as she approached a secluded corner, hidden by towering stacks of crates. Peeking around, She saw a dimly lit room, the flickering lights revealing a scene from a nightmare. Cages lined the walls, some empty, some holding the twisted forms of creatures she recognized from the video. Their eyes glowed in the dark, watching her with a mix of fear and malice. Her breath caught in her throat as she spotted Mike, tied to a chair in the center of the room, his face a mask of pain and desperation. His eyes widened when he saw her, his mouth moving soundlessly, a piece of duct tape sealing his cries. She took a step forward, her hand reaching for the knife in her pocket. The floor creaked under her weight, and the creature's head snapped towards her. With a guttural growl, they began to stir, the cages rattling in a cacophony of fear and rage. Mrs. Jenkins froze, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The buzz grew louder, a generator's hum underscoring the horror of her discovery. Her eyes searched the room for an exit, but there was only one way in, and it was blocked by the creatures. She took a deep breath and stepped back into the shadows, the caged monster's eyes following her retreat. Mike's eyes pleaded with hers, and she knew she couldn't leave him here. The USB stick screen flickered, the video playing on a loop. Mrs. Jenkins focused on it, looking for any clue to what she should do next. As the footage played, she noticed something new. Mike's hand twitched, drawing a symbol in the dust on the floor. It was the same one that had been flashing on the screen moments before. Racing, she memorized the symbol and turned it over in her mind. It was a simple shape, almost like a child's doodle, but it felt significant. She had to get to Mike, had to get him out of there, but the creatures were between them. Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling her lungs. She had to act fast. The creatures had grown restless, their eyes glowing with anticipation. The USB stick, still playing its macabre loop, offered no more secrets. The symbol was her only lead. With a surge of courage, she stepped out of the shadows, the light from the flashlight bobbing with her movements. The creatures grew still, watching her with predatory interest. Mike's eyes darted between her and the cages, his expression a silent plea. Mrs. Jenkins approached the nearest creature, her hand shaking as she held the USB stick out to it. It was a grotesque amalgamation of fur and teeth, its eyes gleaming with hunger. She focused on the symbol in her mind, willing it to be a beacon of peace amidst the horror. "Easy," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. The creature took a tentative step forward, its snarls subsiding into curious growls. It sniffed the air, its nose twitching as it caught her scent. Mrs. Jenkins held her ground, her heart hammering in her chest. The USB stick's light reflected in its eyes, the symbol on the screen seemingly captivating it. Mrs. Jenkins took another step, her arm outstretched with the USB stick. The creature's gaze remained locked on the symbol, its movements cautious but not immediately hostile. Encouraged, she took another step, the gap between them closing. The air grew colder, the hum of the generator a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded her. As she approached Mike, the caged creatures grew restless, their snarls and hisses rising like a chorus of the damned. She ignored them, her focus solely on her neighbor, whose eyes never left hers. With trembling hands, she reached out to remove the tape from his mouth. "We have to get out of here," she whispered urgently. Mike's voice was raspy from disuse. "The symbol," he croaked, his eyes flicking to the USB stick in her hand. "It's a distraction. It keeps them calm." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, understanding dawning. She stepped back, keeping the USB stick's light trained on the creature. "But we need to get out," she murmured. Mike's gaze shifted to the cages, then back to her. "There's a back door," he whispered. "But it's protected." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her eyes flicking to the creatures. "We need to get you out of here," she said firmly, her voice a mix of fear and determination. "Can you stand?" Mike winced as he tried to move his bound wrists. "I think so," he managed, his voice strained. Jenkins looked around, spotting a set of keys hanging from a nail on the wall. She edged closer to the cage, her eyes never leaving the creature's mesmerized gaze. With a deep breath, she lunged for the keys, her arm barely clearing the bars before the creature could react. The metal rattled as she snatched them up, her heart racing. Mike's eyes followed her as she approached the cage. The creatures grew more agitated, their snarls a chilling reminder of their true nature. Mrs. Jenkins inserted the key into the lock, her hands shaking with nerves. The tumblers clicked, and the door swung open with a groan. Mike stumbled out, his legs wobbly from being bound for so long. "This way," he urged, leading her through the maze of cages. The creatures watched their escape, their eyes still fixed on the USB stick's hypnotic glow. They reached the back of the warehouse, where a heavy steel door was barricaded with a thick chain and padlock. Mrs. Jenkins' breath hitched as the screen flickered, revealing the face of a man she didn't recognize, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. His voice crackled through the speakers. "You've come so far, Mrs. Jenkins. But you shouldn't have." Mike tensed beside her. "Who is he?" "The one responsible," she whispered, realization sinking in. This was the person behind the creatures, the experiments, the terror that had upended her life. A sudden metallic click echoed through the facility. The doors behind them slammed shut. "Run." Mike grabbed her wrist, yanking her forward just as a low, guttural growl filled the room. From the shadows, the creatures emerged, twisted, unnatural beings with gleaming, soulless eyes. Mrs. Jenkins barely had time to react before one lunged. She swung the tire iron, smashing it across the creature's skull. It howled, but another took its place. Mike grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and sprayed wildly, creating a cloud of white mist. "This way," he shouted, pulling her toward a steel door at the far end of the hall. They burst inside, slamming it shut behind them. The room was filled with computers, research notes, and a massive glass containment unit. Inside, a grotesque, shifting mass pulsed and twitched. The source of it all. A single button blinked on the control panel, purge. Mrs. Jenkins' hands trembled as she turned to Mike. "If we destroy this, will it stop them?" Mike hesitated, then nodded. "It has to." The door behind them rattled as the creatures pounded against it. No more time to think. Mrs. Jenkins slammed her palm onto the button. A whirring alarm filled the room. The containment unit hissed as fire erupted inside, engulfing the writhing mass in white-hot flames. The ground trembled as the facility's emergency system kicked in, sealing doors, locking everything down. The creatures outside the room let out agonized shrieks, their bodies convulsing as whatever force kept them alive was extinguished. "Time to go," Mike yelled, yanking open a side exit as flames began consuming the lab. They sprinted through the rain, reaching the car just as the facility behind them erupted in a deafening explosion. The shockwave knocked them forward, but when Mrs. Jenkins turned back, all that remained was a smoldering ruin. She gasped for breath, staring at the destruction. "It's over," Mike murmured. Mrs. Jenkins looked at him, then at the burning wreckage. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air felt still. No growls in the darkness. No beeping. No fear. She exhaled. "Let's go home." As they drove away, the flames in the rearview mirror flickered like dying ghosts, leaving the horrors of the night behind them. But as they turned the corner, neither of them noticed the single blinking red light beneath the rubble, a backup system coming online.
If you like creepy stories like these, please subscribe to the channel.